Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a really fascinating, completely universal topic. We're looking at the complex relationship between our romantic status, our deeply ingrained attachment styles, and our overall psychological well-being. Society constantly feeds us this narrative that finding a partner is the ultimate, absolute key to a happy life. But the actual science behind how we attach to others and how we view independence, well, it tells a much richer, way more nuanced story. We're going to break down some seriously groundbreaking research today that just might completely change the way you look at love, independence, and what it actually means to live happily ever after. Let's get into it. So I want you to really think about this for a second. Do you need a romantic relationship to be truly happy? It's a pretty heavy question, right? I mean, from the rom-coms we watch to the inevitable questions our relatives badger us with at holiday dinners, there is this massive societal pressure to couple up. We're almost conditioned to believe that being single is just this temporary waiting period. Like it's a bridge you have to cross to get to your actual life. But how much of that is biological necessity and how much is just a cultural script we've all been handed? To find out, we really need to look at what happens to our psychological well-being when we're coupled up versus when we're flying solo. Okay, let's dive into this baseline data from our sources. When researchers measure psychological well-being, they're looking at things like self-acceptance, environmental mastery, and just having a general sense of purpose in life. And the data from multiple major studies, including a really massive recent survey, kind of validates the societal norm. On average, people in stable, close relationships generally report higher psychological well-being. They tend to score higher in life satisfaction and overall flourishing. On the flip side, singles often report lower general life satisfaction and, well, unsurprisingly, lower love life satisfaction. So on the surface, this seems like an open and shut case, doesn't it? Couples win the happiness contest. Case closed. Well, actually, not exactly. Because relationship status isn't the root cause here. It's really just the surface level of a much deeper psychological mechanism. To understand why people in relationships often report being happier, we have to look under the hood at the hidden driver beneath all of our interpersonal interactions, your attachment style. Decades of psychological research dating all the way back to John Bowlby's foundational work show that our early caregiving experiences during childhood shape what they call our internal working models. Basically, the way our parents or primary caregivers responded to our needs physically wires our brains to expect certain things from the people we love later in life. It's wild. These internal models literally dictate our adult happiness, how we regulate our emotions, and our relationship patterns. And adult attachment essentially breaks down into a few distinct styles. Let's look at them. First up, we have what's known as confidence in adult attachment, which is the absolute hallmark of a secure attachment style. This is characterized by deep trust in others, a high degree of comfort with emotional closeness, and this is key, a positive view of yourself. If you have this style, you generally find it pretty easy to get along with people, and you really don't mind depending on people or having them depend on you. It's like an emotional superpower. The research shows that this secure attachment acts as an incredible protective factor. It promotes long-term emotional stability. It literally lowers your stress hormones during conflict, and it naturally boosts your psychological well-being, whether you're single or in a relationship. Now, contrast that with an anxious attachment style, which is categorized in the research by a high need for approval. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's an intense fear of abandonment paired with a constant and honestly exhausting search for validation. People with this style often feel like others are reluctant to get as close as they'd like. They're hyper-focused on what other people think of them, often to the point of completely sacrificing their own needs. According to an extensive cross-sectional study published by MDPI, this specific trait, this desperate need for approval, strongly and negatively predicts psychological well-being. And here's the real kicker. It destroys your well-being regardless of whether you're single or happily married. The anxiety itself is the thing draining your happiness. Then we have the avoidant attachment style, which is defined by a discomfort with closeness. Imagine someone who essentially builds a giant emotional fortress around themselves. They rely on extreme autonomy, they actively distance themselves emotionally the second things get too real, and they often view interpersonal relationships as totally secondary to their own personal achievements. They use what psychologists call deactivation strategies. Basically, to protect themselves from the vulnerability of rejection, they just pull up the drawbridge and shut off their desire for attachment altogether. They convince themselves, hey, I simply don't need anyone else. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how these traits actually translate into real-world statistics. The MDPI data ran a predictive model, and it proves that possessing this discomfort with closeness actively shrinks your odds of being in a stable relationship. Literally, every incremental increase in someone's discomfort with closeness statistically reduces their likelihood of coupling up. So it's not necessarily that being single makes you unhappy. It's more like people who are naturally avoidant and uncomfortable with intimacy are just far more likely to end up single in the first place. And those exact same avoidant traits also happen to correlate with lower overall psychological well-being. It's a bit of a double whammy. In fact, when the researchers broke down the characteristics of the single individuals in their study, a super clear profile emerged. Compared to their coupled peers, the single participants naturally scored much higher in avoiding closeness. They fundamentally viewed relationships as secondary to other life goals like career or personal hobbies, and they displayed significantly greater avoidance tendencies across the board. They just prefer to depend on themselves rather than trusting a partner. So we're starting to see a self-selecting mechanism here, right? The people who find emotional intimacy difficult are the ones remaining single, and their innate difficulty with that intimacy is the very thing driving down their reported well-being. Which brings us to a really fascinating crossroads, and a question I want you to chew on for a second. Is embracing independence a psychological flaw? Like, does this discomfort with closeness just doom every single person to a life of misery and lower well-being? If you genuinely prefer to be alone, are you just psychologically broken? For a long time, traditional psychology kind of hinted that the answer was yes. But newer research is stepping in to offer a massive narrative twist that completely flips this old assumption right on its head. I absolutely love this quote from a recent study published by Wiley. It says, "Singlehood is often framed within a deficit framework, with the expectation that being single during young adulthood may be costly for well-being." A deficit framework. That means society, and honestly even science, has historically looked at single people and just assumed they're missing something, that they are operating at a deficit. It assumes being single is a problem that urgently needs to be solved. Actually, scratch that, it treats it like a failure. But what if the problem isn't being single? What if the problem is literally just the pressure to not be single? To test this exact idea, researchers surveyed 909 American young adults. This was a huge, incredibly diverse group of people aged 18 to 35. And instead of just asking them, hey, are you single or coupled, the researchers asked them a brilliant new question. How important is it to you to be in a romantic relationship right now? They wanted to analyze the actual importance of romance in these people's minds, completely separate from whether they were actually dating anyone at the time. And the results revealed an incredible twist. They discovered a phenomenon that I like to call relationship dismissal. It turns out that actively placing less importance on romantic relationships becomes a major promotive factor for a single person's well-being. For the single people in the study who intentionally dismissed the importance of romance, the ones who just said, you know what, finding a partner just isn't a priority for me right now, their well-being actually rebounded. Their independence wasn't some avoidant defense mechanism, it was literally a psychological shield against societal pressure. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact breakdown of that mindset. Think about the comparison here. If you're single and you highly desire romance, meaning you're single but you are desperately wishing you weren't, you suffer from lower love life and general satisfaction. The massive gap between what you want and what you have creates real distress. But if you are single and you actively dismiss romance as a high priority, it literally ameliorates the negative effects of singlehood. It protects your well-being. These single individuals bypass the well-being gap entirely. They are just as happy and fulfilled as coupled individuals because they are living in alignment with their own personal goals, not society's expectations. It's a total game changer. So let's pull all of this amazing data together into our core takeaways for this explainer. First, yes, coupled people do often have a higher baseline of well-being, but remember, that's heavily driven by the fact that securely attached people are just more likely to successfully couple up in the first place. Second, an anxious need for approval is the real enemy of happiness, completely destroying your peace of mind regardless of your relationship status. And finally, the ultimate paradigm shift. Singles can absolutely thrive. Independence is not a psychological deficit. By intentionally shifting your attitude, fully embracing your autonomy, and just dismissing the external pressure to find romance, singlehood becomes a completely valid, highly protective state of well-being. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on today. How much does society's pressure to couple up actually dictate your own happiness? Are you chasing a relationship because your secure attachment naturally desires to share life with someone? Or are you chasing it because you're desperately seeking approval from a culture that tells you you're incomplete without a +1? Understanding your own internal working model is really the first step to true psychological freedom. And that's true whether you find that freedom in the arms of a partner or entirely on your own. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this helps you redefine your own happily ever after. See you next time.